I wanted to start by showing everyone images that are artworks that have inspired me, or some of them that just honestly I just copied and kind of go into that. So can everyone see my screen to start off?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I thought I'd give a handful of images and just kind of run through some imageries and kind of tell a story that may or may not necessarily go along with the actual image. But I wanted to give some overlay of why I started painting realistically, and after 15 years, how that came to an end, and then bring that full circle to how I ended up here with you guys and the importance of this class for me personally. So this painting here is a painting by an artist who's become, he's starting to show up museums, and I know him personally because he was actually my sister's husband. And my sister is about 12 years older than me, then he's a few years older than her. So I first met him when I was like 7 or 8 years old, and I was just amazed by the idea of painting. It was totally a new introduction to me. And so a lot of my early works were in a lot of ways just trying to copy him at a really young age. And this was one of his early paintings. But I thought why this could be really particularly applicable to looking at as a class is if you go to the next image, which is his drawing, you can kind of see this like really rudimentary figure of a human being. And, here I'll circle it. It's like you've got his head and maybe his belly and his shoulder and such here. And all of these extra lines are actually what you might call mistakes or leading lines, depending on how you look at it. And it was him starting a drawing, and he didn't like it, so he would basically take a wet brush and blend in the charcoal on the paper, and that's what this background smudge is. And then keep doing that until he had it as he liked it. And then from there, if we go back to the previous image, he would just start filling it in with color. And you can kind of see how all this white on the right of the picture plane, that's actually not the background. That's one of the last layers he did to paint out stuff he didn't like. And so I just thought it would be really illustrative to say, like, these really kind of start, if you look at it, like a coloring book almost. And then you go in and color in each shape. And then if you don't like the background, you just paint a different color on it. And that's really what inspired me as a kid, was to copy him. So a lot of my early paintings were based on this kind of concept. This next one here is Georges Braque, and he was a contemporary of Pablo Picasso. And when I say to copy, I would sit down with my sketchbook and try and make, to the best I could, basically replicas of these, because I was so fascinated by the idea of cubism and how you could look at the same object and be like, oh my gosh, here's part of the guitar and here's part of the guitar. And I always tried to understand it, that what he was doing is he was saying, when you look at a painting or a photograph of say a guitar, for example, you're only seeing it from one angle. But what if you saw it from every single angle at the exact same time? How would that look? And all of a sudden, it means all of the quote unquote mistakes that we make when we're creating art, they're no longer mistakes. They're just different perspectives on the same image. And I really love that starting out, and to think that these are world-renowned pieces now in museums by Picasso and Braque. So it was, hugely influential to me. These next pieces, this is a guy that's actually at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art right now. And I always loved how thick his paint was. And just that they're so expressionistic, because I feel like if there's any one thing in passing that maybe I could say, like, even just in one sentence to try and inspire you guys and people in general in art, is maybe the magic of painting is to let the paint do the talking, as opposed to trying, like I have for so many years, to try and make it look like something. And just like you can see, like, oh, this is where the yellow blends with the white, or the red with the white. And it starts to make magic kind of happen. And this next painting is the same artist, but you can see how similar his art is to the very first artist I showed you, whose name is Jason, the guy that was married to my husband. Or, geez, the guy that was married to my sister. So there we go. This painting is what inspired him. Is he took a lot of his inspiration from this artist, David Park, who has since passed away and is now showing at the moment. And the reason this painting always speaks to me so much, and there's a number of other ones similar to this by David Park, is a lot of times I think as artists, we think to ourselves like, oh, I don't know what to paint, or what should I make, and these kind of things. And this painting, I think, is a particularly beautiful example of when ever we say, I don't know what to make, is think about those stories that you tell. And so the story might start off, when I was a kid, ... Or, for example, when you get together during the holidays with your family and there's those stories that kind of trespass the boundaries year after year of like, oh, remember when Cynthia. That's what I feel like he's doing here, is he's painting a story, and as he goes along, it gets a little bit more ambiguous to what happened. And it's like we all have stories of what happened in our lives and things that were important to us, even if it's just a moment. And he's frozen one of those stories in there. And so it's like, you know, you could say like this guy in the front telling a story. He's like, yeah, me and Eric and Don, we were down at the lake, and this guy we didn't know was sunburned, and he came up in a rowboat and asked for some water, and the story stopped. And so it's like you're watching a movie and someone pressed pause, and it's not realistic because no story is. That's why it's a story, right? It's very ambiguous. But the opposite end of the spectrum of the same idea is this. This is Caravaggio, who painted at after the Renaissance ended. It's when you see what's called Baroque art. And it was meant to freeze in motion. So it's like, again, you were watching a movie and someone pressed pause. And his artwork is considered just a wonderful example of Baroque art. And what it does is it freezes in motion these incredibly intense stories from the Bible. So in Renaissance art, you had people were kind of awkward and stiff, and everything was compositionally balanced. So if there was one person on the left, we'd see one person on the right, and so on. As the Protestant Reformation took off and the Catholic Church was challenged by the growth of Protestantism, they needed a way to try and re-engage the public and bring them back into the church. The way they did that was through these artworks by other artists as well, indeed. But these artworks were, I mean, if you've never seen a motion picture or even a photograph in the 1600s and 1500s, these paintings would shake you, you know, because they're so realistic and they're intense. And I made a copy of this painting as well, and it's something that has always been really influential on me. He has been as a painter. This next one is kind of his, one of his, because he has so many. It's just his magnum opus, you know. And what you're seeing here is this is a conversion of Matthew, who has been a tax collector. And Matthew, before he discovers Christ, who we see on the right here with the halo above his head, Matthew was a shady guy. He was a tax collector. And what that actually meant in the Middle Ages and then all the way up through the 15 and 1600s was a tax collector actually didn't have a salary. So they were sent out by the king to collect money from the king's citizens, and anything they could negotiate past what the king demanded was his salary. So he was always kind of seen as a pretty shady character. And here we see him in this moment in this back alley kind of negotiating with some people over a table, and there's some gambling going on. And this is the precise moment that Christ walks into the room and points to him. And you see him pointing to himself kind of like, who, me? And the light streaming in is supposed to be the metaphor for the light of Christ was beginning to touch him. But I love things like, I mean, this guy's sleeve here with the green and white, and you see the realism of his sleeve and the feathers in the hat. These kind of things really inspired me. And I'll show you now, we'll kind of get into some of my own paintings. This next painting here is a painting that I created and was trying to, this is maybe 10 or 12 years ago, was trying to create realistically something that was lifelike but captured people in motion. And so too had some sort of symbolism where the viewer may not know the symbolism, but they can kind of project their own ideas onto what it might mean. And so this was a really early beginning for me on realism. So to take a real quick break from this, these are photographs in Palestine that an artist named JR put on the separation wall between Israel and Palestine. And what he did is he took pictures of Jews and Muslims and put them next to each other on the wall. And this artist now, he actually had an exhibit at MoMA before COVID. And the reason he's so impactful is he's become world renowned because he doesn't actually do much of any of his art anymore. he empowers communities to do projects like this, where he says, go out and take pictures of people in your community. And then his company effectively prints off the photographs, and then all the community gets together and puts them out together. So I really became inspired by this idea of that art could be so much beyond the actual physical act of creating it. And it was a concept of bringing human beings together, kind of like our class here, that it's like some energy starts happening and people start creating ideas and sharing ideas. This is one of those group actions in process. So you can see just numerous people all pasting these photos onto the floor. And if you Google him, I mean, every single continent in the world, you know, Africa, South America, North America, Europe, everywhere has done this project. And it's just a fascinating idea of that art can transcend the boundaries even of the artist's own hands. So I'll kind of lead in with everything from this. This is one of the first paintings I created, which led me to a 5-year-long project where I created a not-for-profit. And I live in the Tenderloin, which is the inner city neighborhood in San Francisco that has the highest poverty rate and unemployment rate in the city, and incredible amounts of homelessness. This is a guy I met who was drinking a beer next to the courthouse, and I got talking to him, and I went home and painted him. And I had become fascinated with the idea that if I just engaged these people, they were no longer scary on the street. They became, you know, incredible human beings that were very real. And he was a Vietnam War veteran. And the reason I tell you this is this set me on this path of wanting to paint realistically. But where that started from is right after I moved to San Francisco, I had been out of the country for a few years, and I moved here, and within a handful of days of moving to San Francisco, I find out that my mother was dying. And after going to visit her a number of times, when she finally passed away a couple months later, I realized that one day that was going to be me, and that some of these things that she was dealing with, inevitably, these things get passed onward. And so I thought to myself, well, if there's one thing that you can do before you die, what would it be? And I said to myself, the thing that I was most insecure about was I'd been a painter, and I wanted to learn to paint realistically. So I spent the next 15 years practicing every single day. And this was one of the earlier work when I started to feel comfortable sharing them and showing them and so on. Nice. And I never saw this man again after, you know, having painting him, but that's in stark contrast to this. So this is a pencil drawing that I would enlarge. And this enlarged pencil drawing, I would go, so basically I would do a drawing on a sheet of paper and then enlarge it. And so here it is, it's about, you know, 11 foot by 9 foot, more or less. And it was a drawing of a guy I met one time. And the funny story of this is, as I'm putting it on the wall, I hear these screechy bike brakes behind me, and I haven't seen this guy since. I hadn't seen him like in a month since I took his photo. I draw his photo, I thought I'd never seen him again, kind of like the previous painting. And I hear these bike brakes behind me, and I hear this voice behind me say, "Holy shit, that's me." And I turn around, and sure enough, it's him. And he's blown away because he was a homeless street musician. And, you know, he was just fascinated that someone would not only draw him. And of course, he had forgotten that I'd even taken his photograph. But that experience and that drawing led to this painting. And this painting led to me drawing or painting him maybe another dozen times over the years. And we became best friends. And he met my father numerous times, and we did some art projects together. The reason I bring it up is he recently passed away, and I would go and visit him in hospice care. And after 12 years of an incredible friendship with him and creating art projects together, he calls me one day on the phone from hospice care and tells me that his last wish is to meet his son. And I think to myself, like, oh my God, like, I've known this guy for 12 years and I had no idea he had a son. Well, he hadn't seen his son in over 22 years. And I start looking through these research databases trying to find this guy. And he had told me, oh, the guy's mom is such and such a story. And he told me the story. And the truth is, even though he was my best friend and I knew him for 12 years, I didn't believe the story. The story was that this woman was someone that he had had a child with, and they had lived together for years. He had helped put her through school. She had become a very wealthy lawyer. He had put her through school by selling drugs. And I never really thought the story was true. And I found out 22 years of not seeing his son later, and I finally met his son, and his son actually lived in Florida. And the way I found him was I simply took him at his word and Googled the woman's name. And sure enough, the first Google search is she is a renowned lawyer in South Florida now. And I called her office, spoke to her secretary, and 24 hours later, her son was there with his father, who he hadn't seen in, almost 23 years. And so it really taught me this lesson of the idea that we never know what's true, and sometimes our own doubts towards the people we're around are, maybe it held me back from some of the beauty that could have been, or something like this. But he was a beautiful friend of mine. And this series led to these drawings and paintings. And you can kind of see here me in my studio doing these really large drawings of the homeless people's faces. Then what started from all of this is me on the street in the Tenderloin giving away t-shirts and cans of food. And what happened was, as I started printing the drawings of my t-shirts and giving them to the homeless, and they would sell a t-shirt with their own face on it. And as I started doing that, I started meeting more and more people who wanted that. So I basically started this as a nonprofit. And here in the next picture, you had people on the street that were getting the shirts and just their excitement and this kind of community event. This here is a guy who's still a friend of mine, and he is Native American, and asked that I do a drawing of him with a headdress on. And he sold that shirt for years and years. And the way I funded this was that when the first iPhone came out, it was when you could scan, it looks like a square UPC code. It's called a QR code, and you could scan it with your iPhone. When you scanned it, what it did is it opened up a website. And that website that someone could scan on a poster on the street opened up a website where you could buy the shirt for $25. With that, then I could print 12 more shirts and give them to these guys that lived on the street. And so what it did is it introduced a demographic that could afford the first smartphone with the demographic that lived on the street. And then these guys, when they sold the shirts, they kept 100% of the profit. So it incentivized them to walk around the city and meet new people and have them basically reciprocate the experience I had had, where it was like, oh my gosh, these are human beings, they're not to be afraid of. And it was a wonderful thing that went on for years. And like I say, to this day, I'm still friends with, this guy's name is Joe.
Wow.
And I'll just roll through a couple of these. These led me to, this is painted on steel. And I just wanted to show these as like, when we talk about what we paint on, it's like, man, you can paint on, anything that's a surface. And these are different chemicals I was pouring on steel. And the black up here is actually Coca-Cola. That Coca-Cola is extremely acidic and it starts to eat through the steel. And then the rust is from different chemicals, and the white, all these are different chemicals. And I just painted this part, of course, on there. The same thing with this one. And so it's this rusted steel. But this kind of started to create this huge change of things, is where I got into, that was maybe 7-8 years of doing that painting realistically. And what I discovered was I could take a candle, and this is a 3-foot by 4-foot wood panel, and it's all drawn with a candle. So I would put the panel above me as if it were a ceiling, and I would crouch down on the floor underneath it with a candle, and then basically burn these marks onto the wood panel. And what that did is it recreated how the first artworks were ever made tens of thousands of years ago in the caves of like Lascaux and Altamira in Spain. And that when they would put their bonfires inside these caves, they started discovering it and put ash on the ceiling, so they could wipe the ash off, mix it with animal fat, and then do drawings of like animals they were hunting and the religious ceremonies they were having. So I started doing that and mixing it with a little bit of this paint thinner, basically, so that it would have thinner effects and thicker effects and so on. And so it was kind of me finding some sort of homage to the very first artworks ever made, at least in my opinion. And that kind of got a little bit more, I got a bit crazy with things. So you can see the backgrounds here. These are Billboard posters, and I spent over a year collecting torn up Billboard posters from around San Francisco, and I had a big enough collection that was the size of a small couch in my studio, and I started gluing them to canvas and wood board. And then the white in here is spray paint. and the black is the same thing. So the black is a candle where I burnt into the image, and you can kind of see like the tops of her breast, and then in the white highlights in her hair. Those are where I've taken a spray paint can and done these little accents, but all of the black otherwise is the burn marks. And so, you know, obviously with the idea of being really careful, it's like you really can make art with just so much of almost anything, a candle on a piece of wood.
How big is that one, Hugh?
This one here is 3 foot by 4 foot. And then this one here is a little bit smaller, like say 2 foot by 3 foot. And the figures, and this is a thing I was going to suggest to think about, is for me, one of the best ways to start in on drawing a figure or something is like with that first sketch we saw where it looked like it was lots of mistakes, and that's what kind of made it beautiful, is doing something like that and then mixing it with sculpture. If you look at this Google image of classical sculpture, so all I was doing was Googling classic sculpture, and you can see it in this. It's part of a fountain in Paris. And this here, and this sculpture, because it's black and white, it simplifies the image, and it makes for like really user friendly in order to draw. And so I started creating lots of these. And I created entire body work on that. Now here you'll see a huge departure. This is something we've talked about in class about painting your background black and then painting on top of black. This is where I got that idea from. So you can see the background is black, and then if you zoom in, all of this is white that I was spreading with a rubber spatula. So I would have a black background, put a little bit of white paint on there, and then while it was wet, I would just smear it around, and it would create these little worlds.
Wow.
This here, we were talking about abstraction and such, and this abstraction is a Rorschach Inkblot, which was developed in Switzerland by a psychiatrist, and he would show his patients an inkblot that was absolutely nothing. It was just splotches of ink on a page, and he would show it to you and say, what do you see? First association. And the idea initially was that he could be able to read into some of the psychological aspects of his patients. I became fascinated with these, so I started making art the same way as doing these abstract, you know, Rorschach Inkblots. This ended up being what I thought was the best piece in that series, and it's a life-size piece where each one of these figures has this kind of little universe. It gets a little blurry with the photo enlarged, but little universes inside of them that are all the same methodology. And something else we talked about in class, see how the purple in this background almost glows? The trick on that was that I found out if I put white on top of black and then take a really thin color, any color, and put it on top of the white, and it will actually make it, the white still shows through, and it makes it look like it's glowing. So
wow.
Some little silly things. This is a similar thing that I thought is another excellent thing that I could share perhaps is, see how, so this is the same thing. It's a Rorschach Inkblot where these two colorful characters are more or less the same size and shape of each other. And after the white paint dried, what I did is I just went in and just made a blue line. Then next to the blue line, I put a pink line. Then next to the pink line, I put a yellow line. And just kept doing that all over. And it's like, you can do that if you had a piece of paper right now and just drew a square on it and then did that same idea on that square of one concentric line after the other. It almost always has a wonderfully beautiful effect. So maybe someday if you're like, I don't know what to draw today, try that. This is where I really started to take a departure. It was the first time in my life I started trying to do abstract art. And it kind of became a fascination with deep space and photographs from the Hubble telescope, and just different visions that I was having in different colors that really seemed to speak of, if you look up images of like deep space in the Hubble telescope. So
wow. Can you go back to that one again, Hugh?
Sure.
And talk about those the shapes that you put in there.
Yeah, I can tell you. So
like the translucent aqua colors and the greens. How did you get them to sparkle like a diamond?
The one trick on, and this is actually it looks way more complex than it actually is to do these blue lines. What I did is I went to the hardware store and bought what do you call it, a paint roller, like if you were going to paint your house.
Mm-hmm.
And you buy the cheapest one that's made out of foam, and it has a rounded tip on the end. And what you can do is I would dip that in white paint and then just touch it in blue. So I haven't even mixed the paints yet. And I would rub that roller tip in big circles. And so this painting's really big. It's like 5 foot by 6 foot. And so you can see if you spin your arm in a circle, those circles are almost all about the exact circumference that my arm can spin in, because that's exactly what I was doing.
Wow.
Is I would just hold that roller and I would just spin it on the canvas in a circle as big as my arm could go. And instead of blending the paint, is I would just and you could kind of see where maybe on the edge of one side of the roller there was white, and on the edge of the other side here there was blue. And so it never really mixes together except for a little bit. And that kind of creates this optical illusion like you're seeing, Carol, where your eye starts to blend those colors together and make it sparkle.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And really there's just a lot of things of just messing around and like this here is, I've really come to like it at the time. It's really just, we looked at and talked about Rothko, who's really a really big influence and inspired me. Is this is a black canvas in the background, and then the blue, and then every time the blue layer would dry, I would take the same blue, add just a dot of white to it, and do same thing. Then when that dried, I would add 2 dots of white, and I just kept doing that super, super thin, and it would create this kind of like almost same sort of glowing effect on the canvas. And then I'll kind of briefly roll through these last ones so I can get to how it came to be in this class. This was a project I started in the Philippines, where I took photographs. These are 3 foot by 3 foot black and white photographs I transferred onto canvas. And we took the profits and proceeds from these and built a water well project in the Philippines for this indigenous tribe. And the guy I worked with on this, he started a nonprofit because he grew up in the Philippines with this tribe and still wanted to go back and do something for them. So they're called the IDA, and the foundation is called the idatribes.org. And what they do is they pass out sanitary water containers and water buffaloes to these people in really remote villages. So these are basically my first ever attempt at photography. And then this one I just wanted to show. This is one of the water buffalo we bought, and we gave it to this guy and his family, and it was incredible. I never could have estimated the impact. Like, she started crying, and he was dancing like he'd won the lottery. It was an incredible moment. And so this was a project, again, like me trying to incorporate ideas that went beyond my own hands, and seeing if I could collaborate with other people and other ideas and do something bigger than myself. And you guys probably know this.
Why did they get excited about? I'm sorry.
No.
Why did they get excited about a water buffalo? What has it provided for them with that animal?
Oh, good question. They provide basically the same thing that you and I would think of as whole milk when we go to the grocery store. So it's a full fat milk, but it also, because it hasn't been pasteurized, it has probiotics in it. So they find that in drinking this, it's really good nutrition for their kids, but it also helps by breeding healthy gut bacteria, which helps them to combat parasites and things like this, because they live out, as you can kind of see in the background, out in the jungle in thatch roofed houses. And then the way the village dealt with this is, when this is a female, when she gives birth, the family, the guy in the red scarf here, he'll keep the baby, and then his neighbor will take this and they continue that process on. And so a village of 20 or 30 people will get a lot of work, nutrition, and these kind of things out of them. So it was a big deal for him. And I think some of it meant less labor for him in the field, because now he had a water buffalo that could do some of the most laborious stuff.
Wow.
And then I did a talk in Darcy's Friday class on Dutch still lifes, and they've had a huge it's been a huge inspiration for me in all of their layered symbolism. This here is one of them I really like, but it really inspired one of my recent bodies of work. And this is the first painting in that. So I kind of looked at my artwork for the past 12 years at that, 12, 13 years at that point, and thought what was my biggest criticism of myself was that I didn't feel like my paintings had very much movement in them, and they were kind of rigid and frozen. And so I tried to create a portrait that had movement and feeling to it, and added the flowers just because I loved the meaning and symbolism behind the flowers. This painting is the second to last thing here I'll show you.
Wow.
So this painting is kind of a dream come true. You can kind of see like it's a person with their hands. I'm kind of circling their hands here and their forearms, and their hands are in prayer in front of their face. And then there's little bumblebees zipping around there. So the great beauty of this was that it was a dream come true for me, because after I was out of the States, I moved back to America and I went to stay with my mother, and my father agreed to drive me to the airport. And we get in the car to go to the airport. And so there I am as a young artist getting ready to move to San Francisco. And he turns on the car and an interview comes on the radio. It's NPR, and they were doing an interview with the architects Herzog and de Muren, who had just redesigned the De Young Art Museum. So we listened on the way to the airport, this whole interview about the De Young Art Museum. And of course, as a young artist getting ready to move here, I always dreamed of showing my artwork there. And as of 15 years of dreaming it, it finally came true. So this painting actually is at the De Young Museum now.
Oh, very good.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's just been a beautiful,
Yeah,
thank
my
you,
sister and
stroke
I
of
go to
fortune.
De Young. We'll have to look for that.
Yeah,
Very
please do. It's been really enjoyable. And then the next painting here is the great irony perhaps of all of this is this was the last painting I created that was realistic. I finished it almost a year ago today, and it's of course based on La Pietà, which is the Michelangelo sculpture where it's the Virgin Mary holding Christ. And I painted myself as Christ. And so in that moment of what you see when you're looking at Christ is that he has just died, and she doesn't know it yet, but he's about to be reborn. And it's a testament to all of the suffering that he went through. The great irony for this, and why I say it being the last realistic piece. So this is a life-size piece. I painted myself as Christ, and it was as if I predicted something terrible, because shortly thereafter I had some very intense injuries and to my back and hip, and the intensity of them and the trauma challenged my ability to. It's funny. I'm feeling much better now. I'm doing really well, but I started to lose my ability to control some of my hands and my movements and my feet. And so after 15 years of dedicating my life to painting realistically, it was as if in one stroke of misfortune, I had lost everything. And this became psychologically just absolutely debilitating to me in the first few months of this year. Then on top of that, COVID was going on, and then I had interactions with that. And so this year has been phenomenally intense. And I'm starting to feel better and better. And the funny thing is that the title of this painting, like the talk I gave in this class about the Renaissance, the title of this painting is Rebirth. And so in some ways, it's now predicting that it will be a rebirth of myself, because the first painting I did after numerous months of not being able to paint and to control some of my gesticulations and such was actually in this class with Darcy and you guys painting landscapes. So the last image I'll leave you with was this, which is the most recent landscape. And it's very much so this class has been an opportunity for me to relearn to paint. And so it's been me starting from zero again. So the painting at the De Young, the great irony of that painting is I couldn't even stretch my own canvas to hang it in the museum. I had to pay someone to do it because I was physically incapable. And I think I wanted to thank you guys and Darcy, because it really has been an opportunity for me to reconnect with the positivity and the energy of art, and also to start to learn some of these things again. and it's been challenging, but it's wonderful. And I just want to say thank you. So thank you very
Oh,
much
you're
for
welcome.
listening.
I'm glad you're
thank
getting
you.
stronger.
Yeah,
Great.
bravo.
This
Yeah.
is one of my
You made a
favorites.
You really
I
have
want,
made a rebirth. I
Yeah.
mean, from making a whole new life for
I
yourself.
want that last